In almost all cases on my first playthrough of reading through a visual novel, I try to play through it completely blind. And so while I've been reading through Rewrite, my first playthrough, I ended up getting a bad ending. For that, I actually ended up getting a bad ending specifically because I had been specifically trying to avoid certain character dialogue options because I was trying to go for a specific heroine. But I didn't know that Rewrite has a solid amount of route locks. And so while I was wondering why Rewrite didn't really feel like it had a whole lot of different dialogue options throughout Common Route, that was the main reason, is because I was specifically choosing things that would lead me to a bad ending. But as I've been thinking, I really don't like route locks specifically within visual novels. And so I was thinking, in the case of Rewrite and looking back at other titles that I played, what is it about route locks that I don't like, but that I'm able to stomach, or I guess in a ways I am fine with a visual novel having bad endings. But I think when you combine the two together, I ended up feeling like there is a conflicting set of philosophies of the purpose of a bad ending compared to the purpose of a route lock, and why both of those, putting them together, don't really flow that well, at least to me. And so today I want to talk about some bad endings as well as route locks that I've experienced through a couple of different visual novels, and comparing and contrasting what exactly maybe is the purpose of those and how it ends up affecting me, the player, and giving my reasons as to why I think bad endings can be done quite well, but at the same time route locks, my reasonings for why I don't like them, the cases and where I think they do work, but then at the same time, why I feel like a lot of the time they end up not landing, at least for me. So let's get into it. So when it comes to bad endings, I think a lot of the time you're either going to have it to where it's going to be two separate camps for what would be considered a bad ending within a visual novel. The one that I feel like exists in a lot of the visual novels that I've read is a bad ending to where you get to the end of Common Route and there's some sort of like ending sequence to where the main character is left alone and you don't end up falling into a romantic relationship with one of the romanceable heroines within the story. So then you get quickly kicked back to the title screen and you gotta go once again and make better choices so that way you can land onto a character route. The other form of bad ending, I think, is the ones where the main character is in some sort of danger, and depending on the choices that you make in that moment, or maybe even a little farther back into the timeline, will dictate as to whether the main character ends up surviving whatever kinds of like fight or skirmish that they end up finding themselves in, and so that way you avoid dying. And I think in both of those instances, what I ended up thinking was that yes, I feel like sometimes bad endings can kind of almost feel like a little bit of a time sink, right? Where it's like maybe depending on like how many saves you keep for a playthrough. I'm someone that specifically tries to keep all of my progress on one route just onto one save menu, despite the fact that a majority of visual novels have literally hundreds of different save files that you could keep your progression on. I try to keep things all consolidated onto one save file. So sometimes maybe if you get a bad ending and the visual novel in question doesn't really have a good way for just kind of going back to the previous dialogue option that would have saved you, you could maybe have a situation where you got to start a whole new playthrough and then control skip all the way back to the point to where you got your bad ending and you got to make one different choice. So I think in some ways, yes, bad endings could be annoying, but at the same time, I feel like I'm fine with bad endings because they're avoidable, right? I feel like in a majority of cases, bad endings are treated as something to where it might even give you like a little bit of extra lore or something, but at the same time gives you, the player, urgency in that you have to make the correct decisions so that way you can avoid that kind of outcome or that inconvenience that I had mentioned previously. So I think bad endings is something to where I think, you know what, it's fine. And actually tying it into an example of a visual novel for how I feel like perfectly demonstrates the philosophy behind a bad ending, what I would say is alongside Rewrite, another visual novel that I had played last year that was untranslated is Clear. And I think in both cases of Rewrite and Clear, the protagonist is treated as somebody that is maybe like antisocial or has a difficult time expressing themselves to others. And so the crux of like having a bad ending within those visual novels of not being able to romance a certain character and then having a bad ending at the end of Common Route is that you as a player needed to go out of your way to make decisions in order to like be more approachable and be able to like close in and get into relationship with one of the main heroines. And so within Clear, I've mentioned it on the channel before in that I think that title is probably like the most difficult visual novel that I played, as far as like going in with a blind playthrough, not having a walkthrough pulled up, and trying to get onto a designated character route. Because I think in that title, I ended up playing through it, I think maybe like a good like 3 or 4 times, trying to like land on a character route, and then eventually decided, okay, well, I guess I need to pull up a walkthrough, because in that title, unlike with maybe some visual novels where it just kind of takes the amount of like points, I guess you could say, for like how many different interactions you've had across all of the different romanceable heroines, and just taking the one that you have the highest like point system with and just putting you onto that character's route. Within Clear, you had to have landed on each and every single dialogue option for that character, and it was kind of confusing because sometimes you would have to do what would maybe feel like the wrong dialogue option, because you would need to go with a different romanceable heroine, and that would lead you onto a scenario where you bump into the character that you're actually aiming for. And so I think within Clear, one example that I think really like pushes home as to why I think bad endings like that exist, and why I'm fine with both the bad endings for romanceable heroines and also for like the death sequences, is that it is avoidable. My favorite quote within any visual novel that I've read comes from Clear, and it's later down onto a certain character route, to where this one character is assessing the main heroine for that route, and they tell them something along the lines of that they are a person that is farther away from finding happiness than the normal person. But just because it is far away does not mean that it is unobtainable. And so with that quote, I feel like for me, that really hits home and makes me feel like that was the purpose of a bad ending in Clear, and by their decision to go ahead and make landing onto a character route a little bit more difficult or tricky than the usual visual novel, was because of the fact that the main protagonist has that sort of like background in that, yes, they find it a little bit harder to express themselves to others, and that by going ahead and having it to where it's a little harder, yes, it is hard, but it is not impossible. And that leads me into the second portion of what I want to talk about within this video, being route locks, to where, yes, bad endings are avoidable, but route locks are impossible. Upon starting a brand new visual novel, if the title that you're playing has route locks on, let's say like 1 or 2 or however many routes, I feel like for me, it was something that didn't really bother me earlier on when I was getting into the medium. But as I played more and more titles, I feel like route locks to me are irritating and in some ways just feel pointless. In the example of Rewrite, there is 5 different romanceable heroines, and I had been trying to go for a specific heroine and could not get onto that specific heroine because I was waiting for the dialogue options to pop up for that character and didn't really get too many of them. And then that's how I ended up getting onto a bad ending. And that's something that like I wasn't too angry over the fact, but it was just something like where I said maybe a bad ending where it almost feels like a bit of a time waster. I wasted my time in a ways trying to go for a specific character route that I was most interested in from the outset, and was not allowed to actually make my way onto that character route because of a route lock. Now, thinking about what would be the purpose behind a route lock, I think the ones that I am like the most content or like fine with experiencing within a visual novel is the cases of where the story is set up in this sort of like mystery kind of format, to where you have some sort of like murder mystery, or there's some sort of like greater thing happening in the background, to where you make things a little bit more linear as far as route progression, so that way it maybe makes more sense as the narrative grows over and over. But at the same time, when I think of like when you put those routes behind romance at the same time, I think it kind of starts to conflict against one another, to where, yes, I think the narrative focus can work. Sometimes I've had visual novels to where maybe, let's say, there's like some sort of reveal that happens at the very tail end of a certain route that then leads into unlocking a new route. Maybe the reveal isn't actually that big. And at the same time, I like it to when I can kind of like piece together the story myself, and I feel like I'm not having my hand held the entire time, and I'm having to be dragged along through a linear route progression and being able to be like, okay, well, now everything makes sense. I like being able to make sense of things on my own time. And then also, I think what I don't particularly like about route locks too, on top of that, is that there's like a number of things actually. Sometimes if you have a route lock, it almost feels like the ones that don't have routes locked behind them can feel kind of like pointless, or this is like the filler route because it's like, oh, it's not important enough to where it doesn't have a route lock behind it. And also that I like within visual novels that have dialogue options that I feel like maybe my playthrough is unique to myself. I feel like I'm not playing the same title that somebody else did because I'm doing it in my own way. And so by having something where it's more linear, I almost feel like that takes away some of the uniqueness factor to me, to where I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm playing it the exact same way that maybe hundreds of other people have done. And that kind of takes a little bit of the fun away from me, at least personally. Tying it back in with how I said earlier in the video, where it kind of like is intertwined sometimes with bad endings, but at the same time, they kind of conflict against one another. An example that I have different from Rewrite for a visual novel that I read very early on when I was getting into the medium is If My Heart Had Wings. And I think in that title, I was not bothered when I was playing through that title years and years back. I think literally maybe like 7 years ago, I want to say, was when I played that title. And I was not bothered by the fact that there was route locks behind it. But looking back on it, when I was trying to think of maybe some examples to talk about in this video, I feel like If My Heart Had Wings has a number of route locks that almost kind of don't make sense. You have the main heroine, what I would say is like the main girl of If My Heart Had Wings is available right from the start. And then you only have the childhood friend, and her route does not have any route locks locked behind it, which feels a little weird because, like I said, maybe it's like a case to where it feels like that childhood friend route feels a little pointless and maybe is like sort of like a filler route, because what do you mean that the 3 other routes in If My Heart Had Wings are all locked behind playing the main heroine, and then there's this one other side route that's just kind of there at the start. So it feels like there's not a whole lot of like player expression. I can't actually choose to play 3 whole other routes from the start of If My Heart Had Wings. And in a way too, I think you could argue that one of the routes that is locked behind in If My Heart Had Wings has some sort of like maybe like lore implications, and like I said, maybe some sort of like reveal that makes it to where you have to play that route in order to have the information to get into these other characters' route. But it's really not all that deep looking back. And at the same time, I almost think like in real life too, tying it back with maybe that quote that I had from Clear about that things can be difficult, but it's not impossible. How much, like, what would be the case of like in real life if, I think a lot of visual novel fans, maybe I am overgeneralizing, but I feel like a decent amount of people that might be playing visual novels, specifically romance-centered ones, maybe are doing so because of the fact that they are not in a relationship IRL, right? And they want some sort of like escapism. What would be the IRL situation of a route lock? To where are you going to start dating someone in order to like, I guess, get in and have access to their best friend, right? Like, I feel like that's messed up. So like, what would be the IRL implications of like a route lock, to where you're telling me within a visual novel, I have to have previous knowledge from like dating this other character before I can actually like have a chance or a shot at this other character that I'm maybe more interested in. So that's why I would say maybe like in the example of If My Heart Had Wings, the one route out of those 3 that are locked, I would say maybe has a little bit more like story and lore implications, to where, yes, I think you could say, oh, you have to play this character route before you have the knowledge to then go ahead and play this other one. And maybe it's like you get more gratification by having that knowledge. But like I said earlier, I feel like I enjoy being able to piece things together myself, and where I think it doesn't really work. And then there's also just 2 other routes. Those 2 other routes are actually kind of a like sequence of locks, because you only unlock one that then actually kind of functions like a bad ending, to where it's like a set of twins. And the first twin is just like a solo route where you play through, you get to the end, and it's almost treated like a bad ending. And then by completing that one, you then unlock the final route within that string of like 3 different character routes that are all locked one by one, where you get to romance both twins, and that's treated as the good ending. And that's where I was like, maybe looking back at If My Heart Had Wings, I feel like I was not really thinking about it. If My Heart Had Wings was my 3rd visual novel that I had ever read, and so I wasn't really going and really like scrutinizing and thinking, you know what, this feels off, because I didn't really have much to base it off of at that point. But I think looking back now, If My Heart Had Wings has a very like weird set of like restrictions when it comes to all of the different like route locks and how you can go ahead and progress through the story if you're somebody that's starting from a fresh save. a fresh copy of the game. But yes, I guess that is just me yapping a little bit as for what I feel like is maybe the conflictions between bad endings and route locks within visual novels, and expressing why I think bad endings can work and that I'm fine with bad endings because they are avoidable, while within route locks it is something to where I can see the instances to where it would work, but I feel like a majority of the times I don't really like it, and in a way just kind of irritates me and feels like it just kind of restricts me from how I enjoy reading visual novels. So yeah, those have been my thoughts on both bad endings and route locks in visual novels. I've been Wave. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.